post the link both on YouTube and on Facebook.
Just a moment.
Okay.
I will record it anyway, but
yeah, you told me that.
So
post the link both on YouTube and on Facebook.
Now we are live. Just a moment. I will send you the link. I will record it anyway.
Yeah, you told me that.
So
post the link both on YouTube and on Facebook.
Now we are live. I will send it. Okay, Ilie, please.
So, good evening. I don't see, even if I don't see the link, are we live on Facebook or just on YouTube?
On YouTube, and I will get the link on Facebook.
Okay, because I'm waiting for it. Okay. So, my name is Giulio Razio. I mean, it goes without saying. I'm really happy, even with the delay we're having and with the technical difficulties, to get our conversation going. And on behalf of the Journal of Romanian Studies and the co-editors, I'm really happy to have a conversation between Peter Gross and Marian Voicu. I'm going to introduce the two of you, then let you talk for maybe 20 minutes now or 30 minutes. And then, because it seems that since we're not live yet on Facebook, we might not get questions. But hopefully by the time we're into your talk, we might be able to have a stream on Facebook as well. So I'm just going to introduce the two of you, and then invite you to talk about your book, Marian. So Peter Gross is Professor Emeritus and former Director of the University of Tennessee's School of Journalism and Electronic Media. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Media, Data and Society at CEU in Vienna, Austria now. And he's a long-standing columnist for Transitions Online, a Czech-based journal on East and Central European politics, economics, society, culture, and media. His research focuses on East, Central, and Southeast European societies, media, journalism, and culture. And among his many accomplishments, let me just mention 2 out of his 12 authored or co-authored books: Entangled Evolutions, Media and Democratization in Eastern Europe, and Media Transformations in the Post-Communist World, Eastern Europe's Tortured Path to Change. Peter is also Dr. Honoris Causa of both the University of Bucharest and the West University of Timișoara. And in 2018, the University of Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj accorded him the title of Professor Honoris Causa. And Marian Voicu, he's a TV and radio journalist, a filmmaker, and a non-fiction writer. He produced and hosted various award-winning shows and is deeply passionate about documentary films. He has worked for the Romanian National Television since 1996 as a reporter, news presenter, talk show host, and producer. He also held editorial managing positions at Europa FM in Romania and Radio Chișinău in Moldova. Most recently, he's a board member and publisher of Veridica.ro, a monitoring service focusing on analyzing fake news and misinformation campaigns in Central and Eastern Europe. Marian also authored 2 books and co-authored a third one. His books are Tezaurul României de la Moscova, Inventarul unei istorii de 100 de ani, and of course, Matrioșca Mincinoșilor, Fake News, Manipulare, Populism, which is the main reason for our get-together tonight. So one last thing before I let you begin the conversation is the purpose for our book talks is to invite authors whose books we actually review in our journal. And Peter reviewed Marian's book in the fall 2020 issue of the Journal for Romanian Studies. So gentlemen, thank you again for taking part in our book talk, and we're ready for your discussion.
Thank you very much, Iuliu Rațiu, not only for the introduction, but also for having the inspiration to suggest the book talk program, of which this is the inaugural one. And as you have mentioned, we welcome Mr. Marian Voicu to talk about his book, The Matrioșca of Liars, which is aptly named for today's world, in which disinformation and fake news seems to be on the lips of everyone, from scholars to politicians and so forth. I was very much impressed by Mr. Voicu's book because he manages quite successfully, as I said in my review, and felicitously, to combine well-informed journalism with traditional scholarship, resulting in a work which I consider very important. And as I have said in my review and told Mr. Voicu before, we're expecting a follow-up because his work is excellent and the topic demands it. The book is organized in 3 essential sections, one dealing with the Cold War of disinformation, the labyrinth of lies, and who controls the truth. This just about covers the main issues that we are all concerned with, of course, in an era in which, as Mr. Voicu quotes my former professor, James Carey, news is not information, but it is theater. Unfortunately, it is the kind of theater that is less entertaining than it is dangerous. It is dangerous to democracy. It is dangerous to relations between nations. It is dangerous to an informed public. So we have a topic here that seems to be a constant concern and will remain so for the foreseeable future. So my first question to begin the discussion is this. The book appeared in 2018. It takes a while to write a book, of course. And so at the very least, the book is 2 years old. In general terms, before we go into specifics, Mr. Voicu, what have you noticed, if any, changes have occurred in Russian disinformation, in domestic disinformation, in the whole area of fake news?
Well, good evening. Thank you, Professor Gross, for your kind words and review. Thank you, Mr. Rațiu, for this opportunity. 2 years ago, when Humanitas published this book, the subject still seemed exotic. It seemed that this phenomenon of global magnitude has minor marginal incidents. 6 years ago, when I started documenting fake news, I researched in particular the impact on elections and conflicts. Last year, the pandemic has strengthened everything. I mean, this infodemia has shown us that disinformation can have major consequences for public health. I think we are at the beginning of the second wave of fake news. The beginning of the first wave on a large scale, from my point of view, is the Euromaidan in Kiev in November 2013. The annexation of Crimea, the war in eastern Ukraine were fueled by an unprecedented intoxication with fake news, first in Ukraine and then throughout Europe. Brexit, the referendum in Catalonia, the elections in France, United States were the next milestones. Elections will always be the most sensitive targets for state and non-state actors who want to influence and distort the outcome. This time, conspiracy theories abound, and they are reinforced with fake news and wrapped in hate speech. The stakes are high, as in the first wave, but then people died because of the hybrid war. Now people can die as a result of the deniers that paralyzes the medical system to overwork. There has been a mutation in the fake news, which acts like a virus in the social body. It's a new strain, if you want. And this time the trigger is not chauvinism, is not xenophobia, is not ultranationalism, it's simply fear. But the goal is the same, splitting the society, decreasing the immunity of the social body. If you can be stronger, make the others weaker. That's an old principle of the Bolsheviks. So that, I think, it's new, and it came out last year.
Well, this second wave seems to me to go along the same trajectory that the first wave went, with perhaps your notion of increased fear, but it's still principally, when you look at disinformation and fake news, it's a matter of confusion, of confusing people, of misleading people, of camouflaging intentions, of deceiving, of instilling doubt. This has not changed so much. We have this case of the Russian dissident Navalny, who was poisoned. In the last 2 weeks, we've had Russian disinformation suggest that he poisoned himself, that his friends poisoned him, that he had an existing condition that was simply aggravated by him trying to lose weight. These are marvelous pieces of fiction, all different because deception, of course, sowing doubt is one of the most important things that Russian disinformation does so very well. Could you please address the difference, if there is any, between disinformation and misinformation on the one hand, and fake news on the other hand? Is there a difference?
Well, I think that the guys that are responsible for promoting false news their aim is just to increase maybe the traffic, or maybe they are not very careful with their sources, with the topic. They are simply not doing their job. But when we speak about fake news, I think that behind fake news, you have to have a budget, a strategy, objectives, and finally, ideology. It's like a military campaign. And you can see the Russian model of it. It is served, it's promoted by the GRU, by FSB, the secret services. They know how to do it. I mean, for at least 100 years, since Lenin liked so much Maskirovka, the art of deception. Um, they knew how to refine this art. So the differences are major, and the objectives are very important. For instance, splitting the society. You can see the narratives. If you identify the narratives, it will be more simple, more obvious to identify the fake news, not the false news. For instance, the Russian narratives are that EU is weak in the pandemic, for instance. It's selfish, it's preoccupied with itself, it no longer helps its own members, and we have the case of the Italy, which would have been helped by Russia, not by Brussels, to overcome the pandemic crisis. Another narrative is that the EU will disintegrate as a result of pandemic, that the West conspires against poor countries, that the West is behind all the color revolutions, that fascism is getting stronger and the West is unfit to fight against, and Russia will have to save the West again, as in the World War II. Russia will not only save the world from fascism, it will save us from homosexuality, and will save us from the so-called political correctness and human rights, as Patriarch Kirill once said, that it's a perfidious tool of the West. So these are the big narratives. When you see that the fake news are related and are serving these narratives, the difference it's clear.
You mentioned the Russian practice of maskirovka, that is to deceive to one extent or another. That, of course, dates all the way back to Catherine the Great's time and Prince Potemkin, and has evolved since then. Let me switch tracks just a little bit here. We know that the information warfare emanating from Russia, and now also from China, of course, and some other countries as well, is dangerous to countries across the globe. Could you please address the dangers of domestic disinformation and misinformation? That is, that which is produced within a country by that country's own media and the political establishment.
I think that the domestic fake news, at least in Romania, served the narratives supported and cultivated by Kremlin, and I'm speaking about fake news and not false news, because in Romanian language, fake news and false news are translated the same, știri false. Disinformation and misinformation are translated the same, dezinformare. But the differences are huge. So in these last years, the narratives here in Romania are, for instance, that the medical dictatorship, the evil plan of the occult and the world government to crush national independence, and the European colony mantra, the evil 5G network, the violation of religious freedom by an atheist European Union by banning pilgrimages and closing churches. Romanian fake news innovation is weak. It's not original. For instance, you could hear the same fake news mantra like 30 years ago. in the first years after the revolution. The foreigners are to blame because we are experience bad times. The disinformation campaigns had common narratives throughout the region in the former communist countries, which have a common ethos and past. This is very important to know how to speculate on the local specific, to know your audience. And here Russia has an extraordinary know-how. They are good at that. China is not. China is making gross propaganda, especially regarding the medical aid, for instance, provided to Moldova, to Serbia, which are heavily promoted, but rather not so clever that the Russian disinformation. So I think that's the difference, at least in this part of Europe. The useful idiots, the media that has a common agenda with Kremlin, are not so clever like the Russians. The Russians are giving them the big narratives, and they can work then on their with their inspiration to promote these narratives. Maybe the United States are the only place where you have original fake news. For instance, QAnon. This is, you know, we also had here in Romania QAnon. We don't know if the Russians picked up one narrative, one original narrative, for instance, that one from America, and promote it because it's useful for the Russian agenda. Yeah.
It seems that the Russian agenda for disinformation and misinformation does not make much of a distinction between ideologies. That is, they will use, excuse me, they will use, manipulate both the right and the left for their own purposes, of course, because their intention is not ideological at this point. It is not like during the Soviet times. It has the same patterns, perhaps better developed, and the same temptations that arise from the daily happenings in the world. But it's not that much ideological in this sense. Domestic fake news or disinformation and misinformation, as you have mentioned, has completely different purposes. When it overlaps with the Russian, it is not that believable. In Romania, as you mentioned, the credibility of Russian disinformation and misinformation seems to be very low, even when accompanied by local, as you put it, useful idiots or fellow travelers, as we used to say during the Soviet times. So that is of a different quality altogether. Romania had two elections, one in 2019, a presidential election, and a parliamentary election in 2020. What have you observed in regard to Russian disinformation and misinformation during those two campaigns?
I think there were especially compromat campaigns against main targets. Nothing new. This happens in all fluid societies. However, some of the narratives of the 2014 presidential and 2016 parliamentary elections were resumed at a lower intensity, maybe because the Social Democratic Party was more shy, maybe, who knows. Maybe because the former leader, Liviu Dragnea, was no longer on the stage, on the political stage. He was on another stage. But we hear the same mantras, the fake mantras. For instance, one that was still strong was about sovereignty. That is the only solution to save Romania becoming a European colony. Cultivating the national interest by dissociate from selfish Brussels or warrior Washington. What appears to be a legitimate topic of public debate in a democracy has been distorted by fake news and fake mantras in all this region. Maybe the novelty is the rise of a new party, the Alliance for Romanians Unity, AUR, which entered parliament, and the outcome amazed everyone, including the leaders of the party. And that was the funny thing. The electoral rhetoric resumed the disinformation narratives we were talked about: sovereignty, Romania, European colony. We are saving Romanian traditions and values from the Western globalization. We have to protect Romania from immigrants. We have to protect Romania from LGBT movement. We have to save religious liberties against the satanic state. And maybe the logo of this campaign, Diana Șoșoacă put it, is the muzzle. I don't know if this is the right word in English, as they named the mask. Don't put us a muzzle. And this was the slogan for the visible figures of this party. So it was not so heavy disinformation like in 2016, for instance, or 2015, when the rhetoric was unbelievable. I mean, we had these huge anti-government demonstrations in 2017 and 18, and we heard then the same disinformation like 30 years ago against foreign companies, against foreigners, against Soros, and so on and so on. We had the tragedy from Collective that was covered by disinformation. We can hear them at some stations with national coverage that Soros is behind, and the guys from the new party. We had the referendum for the traditional family that was covered again with fake news and disinformation. We had the trial of Liviu Dragnea, and that one also was covered with disinformation because they pointed at the justice and said that this is a corrupt system and you cannot have faith in it. We heard the information about Romania's position as a NATO member, but now, in the last years, it was not so heavy, disinformation. Yes, you do.
Just to follow up on the question about elections, how about the Russian influence in Moldova? I mean, I know you did cover the elections from, were you in Chisinau or from Bucharest? But I mean, you you probably know more than we do. So we know Maya Sandu against all odds, right? But I mean, she planned, right? Or that's a positive outcome of the elections, right? Against all possible influence, right? So I would like you to speak on that subject too.
Yeah, I think in Moldova it's a battlefield. You can see there all the weapons of disinformation, all the experiments. It's unbelievable that they are fighting so much on the ideological field for this piece of land. If you understand what's happening in Moldova, you can understand what's happening in Eastern Europe, because they are mainly the same big narratives. And also the disinformation that came in Romania is it's coming through Sputnik in Romanian language from Chișinău. The election last year was, of course, all the disinformation and fake news campaign was against Maya Sandu. And we heard that, of course, West is preparing a color revolution, that Russia is the only friend for Moldova, that Romanians are fascist and will make a genocide in Transnistria, as the Ukrainians did in Crimea and in Donbass. We heard that Romania is interested just in make business there, not like Russia, for instance, who is really a friend. We heard the big narrative of Ruski Mir, Russian world, that it's very powerful in Moldova and also in Ukraine and also in the Baltic countries as a disinformation campaign, because nostalgia is a weapon for get the former citizens of former Soviet Union to keep in touch with Ruski Mir. It was strange that Dodon couldn't win this time. And it was very interesting. Maybe it was because of the diaspora. I think that that was the main reason. Even if Maya Sandu won also in Republic of Moldova. But something happened in the last 4 years. Something happened, and something happened also in the United States. So who knows?
You cover a number of countries in your book: France, Moldova, USA. Even you have shown tremendous knowledge and understanding of what's happening in all these countries, and with some international issues like Brexit, or more generally in Europe with the European Union. You also have a concluding chapter about recognizing disinformation and fake news and what might be done about it. Could you please address a little bit the role of the media in each country in combating disinformation and misinformation, whether it comes from the Russians or whether it comes indigenously from parts of their own civil society or their own media?
I think imported or not, fake news can make major damages or long-term damage. liberal democracy as we know it is becoming irrelevant in front of our eyes. New models are proposed from Beijing or Moscow or Tehran, illiberal democracy, authoritarian government, and even dictatorship. I think the economic crisis caused by the current pandemic has the magnitude of the Great Depression in the early 1930s. This has produced very different results on the two shores of the Atlantic. In the US, the Great Depression led to the New Deal, but in Europe, Hitler came to power. For now, the signs of the new times are the rise of the populists and the entry of the neo-fascist parties into the parliaments of European states. I think the pandemic crisis has added radicalization. The world will not be the same after this crisis, it is said. But what will change? Liberal democracies seemed weak, but that was because the press was free to show its weaknesses. It's not the same in China or Russia, in Iran or North Korea, but that does not mean that they have managed the crisis better. On the contrary, the problem now is the distrust of the state in general, and of the authorities in particular, at least here in Romania. And that will be the test of democracy as we know it in this part of the world. For now, even populist leaders seems to be overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. I don't think that we have a solution. We are talking about regulating the social networks at the national level. Also, the risk is that authoritarian states will use the opportunity to silence the opposition, as in Russia, where people get 3 years in prison for a comment on social media. On the other hand, it can be seen that banning of groups such as QAnon on Facebook or Twitter reduce disinformation on critical moments, or closing President Trump's accounts. We know already that led to a 73% decrease of disinformation about electoral fraud. We all agree that prohibitions and restrictions on freedom of expression are inappropriate for a liberal democracy. But the argument is that sometimes, especially during elections, it is necessary. As for radio and television, there is always a law and an institution to enforce it. If it's not working properly, there will be a problem. In Romania, most of the disinformation happens on national TV stations. It's unbelievable. Our institution, CNA, cannot manage the situation only through fines and warnings. On long term, I think media literacy is the solution. On short term, I think cultivating skepticism about any kind of information, especially towards alternative sources, could be the solution. But it's hard to transform everyone into a journalist. It's not so easy.
But at the same time, there are some journalists who do their job, right? Yeah. And I just wanted to point out to your, is it like a new project, Veridica.ro, or is it and you are actually monitoring, right, fake news, and this is just as a transition towards trying to close up our conversation, because we do have one question from the audience. It's actually a question from Svetlana, and I also sent you the question of over Messenger, Marianne, but I'm going to read it to you too, because in a way it ties into the conversation we've been having here. Is to what extent the response of fake news to fake news is capable to in a way clear the waters. And Svetlana, and I'm going to read through her question. She's actually taking a long view of history. And she was really interested in reading your book, and she also particularly liked the chapter on Moldova. So Svetlana writes that in that chapter you refer briefly to the events after the First World War and the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. In which the so-called Bessarabian delegation, also the Romanian delegation, they each produced fake news to persuade the great powers, right? So they played their cards, actually, right, to actually for political, for national gains. And Svetlana says that she researched the activity of the delegation as well as that of the Romanian delegation, whose agenda was also to persuade the great powers to recognize the status of Bessarabia as a Romanian province. So her conclusion and the question for you, both sides, although having a different status, they produced fake news. And this is actually the argument that you're making, or part of the argument that you're making, with the aim to disinform, fight back, and persuade. And Svetlana is also curious to actually bring the conversation to today's politics. What about today? Have you observed the production of fake news as response to other fake news? And who were the actors who practiced such a strategy? And you did talk about misinformation, disinformation, fake news, false news, right? Because it might turn out into like an endless war. And if we don't have, I mean, you mentioned literacy, even though Professor Gross retired, he's still active, right? And journalists, it seems that they also have to battle, right, the heavy battles.
Well, thank you for the question. I don't know if the Romanians produced fake news and disinformation in Paris. It was not the Russian delegation that produced that. It was just the former officials from Bessarabia, from Chisinau, that went to Paris and helped the Russians against the Romanians and produced first one tiny book, which became larger and larger and larger. And that one was populated with fake news. For instance, about policemen in Bessarabia that tortured the countrymen. That was not documented in the archives in Chisinau at this extent, this level. So I don't know about this information produced by the Romanian delegation. If there are any, of course, we are interested to hear it. About this war, fake news against fake news, I think the most interesting example is what happened in the last 4 years in United States, where Trump administration invented the term of alternative facts. I think he lived in an alternative reality, and accusing the traditional press media of being fake press, fake news press, is maybe the example that Svetlana is referring to. I mean, when you cannot have a discussion with the other and everyone is accusing the other one of producing fake news, you cannot meet in the public space. The public space is essential for a democracy. Habermas has this wonderful theory about what is public space. And he see it now as consisting of many, many clusters. We are not meeting anymore. Not in the public space, not in the virtual, in the internet. Because we are like depending on different tribes. We are living in these digital ghettos. So I think that's the problem, and this is the dark side of the internet also.
Yeah, I think we ought to remember that American saying that you're entitled to your own opinion, but not to your own facts. And when you talk about alternative facts, there are no such things. There are facts, period, nothing more. But they all can be persuasive. I mean, I'm reminded of the French author Jacques Ellul, who said that all communication is persuasion. And therefore all communication could even have the role of being propaganda. This is why, in my view, it is exceedingly important that we practice journalism according to some normative values that all journalists observe. And that means not being biased, not being selective in your sources and the facts that you present, in the way you organize a story, because all of that contributes to a certain extent to fake news, because you're being, you're constructing a narrative that has a particular goal or comes from a particular perspective, and therefore leaves some facts out, leaves some sources out, leaves a context out that will make the presentation more complete, and therefore less fake in a sense. But on that note, thank you very much. It was a great discussion. We're honored to have you with us, Mr. Voicu, and we hope that you continue your writing on this subject in particular, because it's very, very important. Thank you.
Well, I thank you. I'm deeply honored for this review and also for this talk. Thank you.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much. I also want to plug in, I mean, speaking of communication and like an academic take on journalism, the next issue of the journal is dedicated to media and communication. So keep an eye on that. It's going to be out in the fall. And in the meantime, we do have 2 more book talks, and hopefully we might be able to arrange a better stream from inside Facebook. But thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much for an interesting talk, and I'm actually looking forward to reading your work and to continuing this conversation in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.